6 people are dead in Indiana, 1 is dead in Hawaii. Those two numbers come from opposite ends of the country, and no single storm connects them. In Indiana, the White River crested higher than it has in 113 years. In Hawaii, a hurricane that never officially made landfall pulled occupied homes off their foundations and left more than 88,000 customers in the dark. Neither operation is finished. By the end of this, you will understand why both of these disasters killed in the same way, and why the numbers we build around stopped holding. The United States spent this weekend fighting 2 separate water disasters at the same time, about 4,000 miles apart. And as of this morning, neither one is finished. In Indiana, the White River crested higher than it has at any point in recorded history, breaking a record that had stood since 1913 and killing at least 6 people. In Hawaii, a hurricane that never officially made landfall swept occupied homes off their foundations, killed 1 person, and knocked out power to more than 88,000 customers across 3 islands. These 2 events have nothing to do with each other meteorologically. There is no shared storm system, no common front, no single atmospheric setup linking the Midwest to the Central Pacific. One is a stalled frontal boundary. The other is a tropical cyclone. They are separate systems and separate flow regimes, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling something, but they did their damage in exactly the same way. Neither one was a wind story. Both were water volume stories, and both of them broke through numbers that local infrastructure had been designed around for decades, in Indiana's case, for more than a century. That is the part worth your attention this morning, and it is where this report is going to spend most of its time. Start with Indiana, because Indiana is the bigger story by every measure that matters. The setup began on August 11th when severe storms and heavy rain started spreading across the state. Over the following 2 days, the National Weather Service reported that some areas of Indiana received more than 11 inches of rain. The peak single location total came out of New Castle, which took 11.43 inches. Greensburg took more than 7. Those numbers alone would be significant. What made them catastrophic was the ground they fell on. Indiana had already absorbed repeated rounds of storms in the days leading up to that window. The soil column was effectively full before the heaviest rain arrived. When ground is saturated, the fraction of every additional inch that soaks in collapses toward 0, and the fraction that runs off toward the nearest channel climbs toward 100%. So the 11 inches that fell on August 11th through 13th did not behave like 11 inches of rain. It behaved like something much closer to 11 inches of water poured directly into the river. That distinction is the single most important physical idea in this entire story, and it applies just as cleanly to what happened in Hawaii. It is not the total, it is the rate measured against what the ground underneath can actually take. The White River took all of it. Flooding concentrated along the main stem from Hamilton County down into the northern Indianapolis suburbs, and multiple river systems across the state went under flood warnings simultaneously. This was never confined to one channel, and a river basin does not respond to rain instantly. That lag is the reason a flood like this one unfolds in slow motion instead of arriving as a wall of water. Rain that fell on the upper watershed on August 11th and 12th had to work its way down through tributaries, ditches, and tile drains before it ever reached the gauges the National Weather Service was watching. The heaviest rain had already ended by the time the river was approaching its worst. That is why people in the flooded corridor described watching the water rise under a clear sky. The storm was over, and the crest was still coming. It is also why the warnings issued days in advance were not a false alarm. Forecasters could see the volume already in the system, and could calculate roughly when and where it would arrive. At Anderson, the White River crested on Friday at 24.93 feet. The previous all-time record at Anderson was 23.6 feet. It was set in the Great Flood of 1913, and it had held for 113 years. Friday's crest beat it by 1.33 feet. Upstream at Noblesville, about 15 miles north of Indianapolis, the river broke. Its own 1913 record of 23.8 feet, running to a forecast crest of 24.5 feet, a margin of roughly 7/10 of a foot. Now, here is why the 1913 comparison is not just a headline number. The Great Flood of 1913 was a spring flood. It ran on snowmelt combined with heavy rain in late March. A A storm system brought heavy rain into Indiana on March 23rd of that year, and before it could clear out, a second system tracking up from Texas stalled over southern Indiana for more than 2 days. The combined event dropped 6 to 11 inches of rain across Indiana, Ohio, and parts of Pennsylvania and Kentucky on top of a snowpack that was already melting into ground that was still partially frozen. That is an enormous hydrological load. It is the reason 1913 became the benchmark catastrophe in Indiana, flood history, and stayed there for over a century. This month's flood beat it with rainfall alone. There was no snowpack. There was no frozen ground forcing runoff. There was no spring melt already sitting in the channel when the rain started. August in Indiana is the season when a river should have the most capacity to absorb a shock, not the least. The 1913 record was set with every hydrological advantage stacked in its favor, and a summer thunderstorm sequence just went past it. There's one more thing the two floods share, and it is not a coincidence. In 1913, the proximate cause was a storm system that stalled. In 2026, the proximate cause was a front that stalled. 113 years apart, the same failure mode. Weather that stopped moving over a place that could not drain. At least 6 people have died in flooding and storms across Indiana as of the most recent count. That number was 5 on Friday and was revised upward within about 24 hours, and it should be treated as a live figure. Several people were still reported missing during the peak of the event, and recovery operations along the White River corridor were still active over the weekend. Among the victims was a 4-year-old boy. He did not drown. He was killed when a tree came down on his home, which is a storm wind fatality inside the same event. And it is worth stating precisely because the details of how people die in these events tell you what the actual hazards are. Flooding kills by water. The storms that produce the flooding kill by wind, by falling trees, by vehicles entering water that looks shallower than it is. The rescue numbers give you the scale on the ground. The Indianapolis Fire Department reported pulling 95 people and 45 pets out by late Saturday afternoon. Responders and volunteers ran rescues and welfare checks in Fayette County. A senior mobile home community in Tipton County was evacuated. And if you want a single sentence that captures why flood mortality skews the way it does, it is that sentence. Mobile home communities and floodplains are consistently where the worst outcomes cluster, because the structures have no elevation margin, and the residents frequently have no vehicle. National Guard vehicles joined the response as conditions got worse through Friday and into the weekend. High-clearance military trucks are in the rotation for a reason. Once water is over a road surface, a standard ambulance or patrol car becomes a liability rather than an asset. And the depth that stops a passenger vehicle is far shallower than most drivers believe. A foot of moving water is enough to float most cars. 2 feet will carry almost anything on the roadway. The other detail worth flagging is that swift water rescue is one of the most dangerous jobs in the emergency services, and the demand for it spikes at exactly the moment the environment is worst. 95 people and 45 pets in a single afternoon out of one city's fire department is a very high tempo. It means crews were running back into moving water repeatedly in the dark, around submerged obstacles they could not see, while the river was still rising. The governor of Indiana declared a statewide disaster emergency and requested federal aid. President Trump approved an emergency declaration for the state, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency confirmed that federal disaster assistance was available. Pay attention to the word emergency, because it is doing specific legal work. An emergency declaration is the smaller and faster of the 2 federal instruments. It frees up to $5 million in federal resources, and it is built for immediate response, moving people, moving equipment, keeping the operation running while the water is still up. It is not the instrument that pays to rebuild. The larger one is a major disaster declaration. That is what unlocks individual assistance for households and public assistance for infrastructure repair. And it is what a state needs when a record flood crest has just moved through its second largest metropolitan corridor. Getting there requires joint preliminary damage assessments in the affected counties. And those assessments are the next concrete thing to watch in Indiana. Until they come back, $5 million is the number on the table. and $5 million against a 113-year record crest is a response budget, not a recovery budget. The meteorology behind the Indiana flood is not exotic. It is a stall, and stalls are how ordinary weather becomes a disaster. A frontal boundary set up across the Midwest and then stopped advancing. Hot, humid air pressing north and cooler air holding to the north of the boundary balanced each other out, and the front parked. At the same time, a high-pressure system sitting over the Gulf acted like a conveyor belt, pumping warm, moisture-loaded air northward straight into that stationary boundary. Every disturbance rolling along the jet stream then fired a fresh round of thunderstorm cells along the front. And because those cells tracked perpendicular to the boundary, they crossed the same counties again and again and again. Meteorologists call this training. The image is exactly what it sounds like. Storm cells running down the same track like cars on a train, each one dumping its load on the same ground. It is worth understanding why the boundary refused to move, because that is the part forecasters watch most closely. A front advances when there is a pressure gradient pushing it. When the air masses on either side reach a rough balance and the upper-level steering flow runs parallel to the boundary rather than across it, there is nothing left to shove it along. The front becomes a rail line instead of a wave. Every storm that forms on it then follows the same rail. The total stack in one place instead of spreading across 5 states. Here is the arithmetic that makes it lethal. A thunderstorm that crosses a county in 40 minutes leaves behind a manageable amount of water. The same storm, regenerating over the same county for 2 days, leaves behind a catastrophe. The intensity of any individual cell never has to be unusual. Only the geometry has to be wrong. And the geometry is set by whether the boundary is moving. That is the Indiana story in full. An ordinary summer convective pattern aimed at ground that was already full and held in place long enough to overrun a river record that had survived 113 years. Which brings us 4,000 miles west to a storm that made the same mistake look completely different. Hurricane Lala strengthened from a tropical storm into a Category 1 hurricane on Saturday as it approached Hawaii's Big Island with maximum sustained winds of 75 miles per hour. 120 kilometers per hour. The National Hurricane Center warned of life-threatening conditions. Lala never made an official landfall. It grazed past the island and was later downgraded to a tropical storm as it continued away to the northwest. Forecasters had noted going in that a direct strike would have been Hawaii's first hurricane landfall in more than 30 years. It did not happen. There is no landfall point on the record, and Lala still swept occupied homes off their foundations. Rain in the heaviest bands fell at rates of 3 to 5 inches per hour. One-day totals surpassed 2 feet in some locations. Forecasters called for another 4 to 8 inches across the Big Island and windward Maui behind the initial bands, with maximum storm totals of 30 to 35 inches, a figure that was revised upward during the event from an earlier ceiling of about 25 inches as the storm slowed down. A flash flood emergency was declared Saturday night for the Kau district of Hawaii Island. 2 homes were swept away in Nālahu. Hawaii County Mayor Kimo Alama said publicly that several occupied homes may have been swept off their foundations in the Alihu and Waino areas, and that Hawaii County Civil Defense had launched a joint search and rescue mission using county resources, the Hawaii National Guard, and the United States Coast Guard. 1 person was killed in a storm-related vehicle crash on the Big Island. Understand what that combination means, because it is the same lesson Indiana just delivered in a different accent. The Saffir-Simpson scale measures one thing: sustained wind. Category 1 is the bottom rung of that scale. It told you almost nothing useful about the hazard that actually killed someone and destroyed houses, which was a rain rate of up to 5 inches per hour landing on steep volcanic slopes that rise fast from the coastline. That terrain forces moist air upward and wrings it out, producing rainfall rates far above what the same storm would generate over flat ground or open water. A Category 1 that never landed did this. The category was not wrong. It was measuring the wrong thing. That mismatch has a real cost in how people respond. A Category 1 reads as survivable to most of the public. It is the number people use to decide whether to leave, whether to board up, whether to take the advisory seriously at all. Nothing in that number communicated a 5-inch-per-hour rain rate landing on a slope above a town. And the same problem runs in the opposite direction in Indiana, where severe thunderstorm is one of the most routine warnings in the American Midwest. A stalled line of routine thunderstorms just took down the most famous flood record in the state's history. In both cases, the public-facing scale communicated something close to the inverse of the actual threat. By Saturday evening, more than 88,000 Hawaiian electric customers were without power statewide. Roughly 63,270 on Hawaii Island, 15,260 in Maui County, and 9,500 on Oahu. Earlier Saturday, the figure had been above 40,000. It roughly doubled over the course of the day, which tells you the damage curve was still climbing at the same time the storm itself was being downgraded. On the Hamakua coast of the Big Island, crews were assessing a 42-mile span of transmission line after falling trees took down multiple poles and structures. That is not a scattered outage pattern. That is a corridor failure. And this is where Hawaii's geography turns an electrical problem into a logistics problem. Hawaii's islands are not grid interconnected, not with each other and not with any mainland network. There is no mutual aid convoy that rolls in overnight from 2 states away, because there is no road. Every crew, every pole, every transformer is either already on that island or it arrives by ship or by plane. Hawaiian Electric warned of possible extended outages and told customers on Hawaii Island and Maui to expect to stay dark at least overnight while damage assessments were completed. The same 42 miles of downed line on the mainland is a hard week. On the Big Island, it is a supply chain. There is a second-order problem hiding inside that. An extended island outage takes down water systems that depend on electric pumping. It takes down refrigeration for food and for medication. And it takes down the cell sites that people use to report they are trapped. The same sites emergency managers rely on to find them. Generators cover some of that for a while, and then they run out of fuel. And fuel also has to arrive by ship. None of this is unique to Hawaii in kind. It is only unique in degree because there is no road out. There is one more number worth holding on to here. Hawaii's last hurricane landfall was Iniki on September 11, 1992, a Category 4 that hit Kauai, killed 7 people, and caused about $3.1 billion in 1992 dollars. It remains the most powerful hurricane to strike the state in recorded history. That was 33 years and 11 months ago. Most residents of the Big Island have never been through a hurricane because there has not been one to be through. Preparedness decays across a gap that long, and Lala tested it without even coming ashore. So we have 2 disasters with no meteorological connection whatsoever, both doing their damage through rate rather than total, both overrunning benchmarks set generations ago. It is fair to ask whether there is anything real underneath that pattern, or whether it is just a bad week. There is one physical relationship worth putting on the table, and it needs to be stated carefully. The Clausius-Clapeyron relation describes how much water vapor air can hold as a function of temperature. For every 1 degree Celsius of warming, the atmosphere can carry approximately 7% more moisture. Because the intensity of extreme precipitation is roughly proportional to the moisture available to it. Extreme rainfall. Intensity tends to scale at approximately that same 7% per degree when moisture. Supply is not the limiting factor. Observations and models both show short-duration extreme rainfall intensifying at roughly that rate, and research indicates the whole curve is shifting. The temperature at which rain intensity peaks is rising along with the baseline. Now, the caveats, and they are not decoration. 7% is a global average scaling relationship, not a local guarantee. Studies have found substantial regional and seasonal deviations from strict Clausius-Clapeyron scaling. High-resolution model experiments show hourly extreme scaling above or below the theoretical rate depending on local moisture availability and dynamics. And most importantly, this relationship does not attribute the Indiana flood or Hurricane Lala to any specific cause. It describes the shape of the container. It does not explain why any particular storm formed or where it went. What it does explain is why the record books are under pressure. And that leads to a problem most people have never heard stated plainly. A 100-year flood does not mean a flood that happens once per century. It means a flood with a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. Two of them can land in consecutive years without anything being statistically wrong. But that 1% figure is calculated from the historical gauge record, and the calculation assumes stationarity. It assumes the past is a valid sample of the future. Every floodplain map, every levee height, every culvert diameter, every flood insurance rate map, and a good deal of local building code sits downstream of that assumption. When a 113-year-old record falls to a mechanism that did not set it, rainfall alone beating rainfall plus snowmelt, the assumption itself is what is being tested. And a claim circulating online this weekend that two simultaneous federal-scale disasters cannot possibly be random gets answered by the same arithmetic. The United States and its territories cover more than 3.5 million square miles across two ocean basins. August is peak Central Pacific hurricane season and peak Midwest convective season at the same time. Overlap in that window is the expectation, not the anomaly. 4 things are genuinely unresolved this morning, and they are the ones to track. First, whether Indiana's emergency declaration gets upgraded to a major disaster declaration. The joint preliminary damage assessments in the flooded counties are the trigger, and their findings will be the first real dollar measure of what the flood actually did. Second, whether the death toll of at least 6 holds. It moved from 5 to 6 inside a day, while people were still missing and water was still receding. Recovery operations along the White River and the search and rescue mission in the Alihu and Wayno areas both had open outcomes as of the last update, and the number may still move. Third, whether the new Anderson crest of 24.93 feet becomes the design number, and how long that takes. Floodplain maps and insurance rate maps update on multi-year cycles. The 1913 number governed for 113 years. Whether the 2026 number replaces it in the documents that actually decide where people are allowed to build is the slowest moving thread in this story, and the most consequential one. Fourth, whether the Big Island storm totals reach the upper end of that 30 to 35-inch forecast, and whether the Hamakua transmission corridor comes back on the timeline Hawaiian Electric projected. Here is the takeaway. In both Indiana and Hawaii, the forecast was substantially correct. The National Weather Service in Indianapolis had upgraded the White River outlook from moderate to major severity days before the crest, with flood warnings written to expire out to August 17th, meaning forecasters published in advance that the crest had not yet arrived. The National Hurricane Center used the words life-threatening before Lala's closest approach. Hawaiian Electric pre-warned customers about extended outages. The forecast was not the failure point. The gap between an accurate forecast and a safe outcome is the failure point. And that gap is made of floodplain maps, grid design, evacuation timing, and where people live. Those are all built on numbers from the past. This weekend, 2 of those numbers stopped being the ceiling. We will be tracking the damage assessments, the recovery totals, and the crest revisions as they come.